This mini lecture is another in the Production and Costs series. We're going to focus on profit and the different ways we measure costs, those being implicit and explicit. This one's a little bit longer than the other mini lectures. Buckle up. Profit. By the way, that Greek letter is the Greek letter pi. Please don't attempt to solve for profit by substituting 3.14 for the Greek letter pi. Pi is just there to abbreviate profit because we're going to see price abbreviated with a P. Profit also starts with a P, so we needed a different abbreviation. It's always going to be total revenue minus total costs. Total revenue, which we've calculated before, is calculated as price times quantity. And total revenue is obviously going to be a function of the demand for a firm's products. By the way, you'll see a derivation of this later on, but profit can also be written as quantity times price minus average total cost. That is, you take the average total cost, that's the cost per unit, subtract it from the price, that's the money that the producer receives, you get profit per unit, and then you scale up your profit per unit by the number of units you sell. This is the most commonly written on the hand formula in all of econ, very useful. Explicit costs are costs that you actually have to spend money on. Wages are an example, rent that you pay. These are all examples of explicit costs. You could also think of these as accounting costs. Implicit costs are opportunity costs of using resources that are already owned by the firm. So, for example, working in business while you're not getting a formal salary if you're an owner, or using the ground floor of your home as a retail store, or the basement of your home as a gym and recording studio. Implicit costs also include any kind of costs that you wouldn't pay money for, like depreciation, or like the foregone salary that you're giving up by being in school right now. Accounting profit is total revenue minus only explicit costs. So that's dollars in minus dollars out. So if you turn an accounting profit, you're making money, which is good. Economic profit, though, is total revenue minus total cost. That includes both explicit and implicit costs. So here, you have to subtract not only the money you actually spend, but you also have to subtract your opportunity costs. So if you're turning a profit on paper, but you could be making the same amount of money doing something else, you know what? It's okay. Your economic profit is zero, but an economic profit of zero is still really good. Keep in mind, there are two ways to write this: total revenue minus explicit costs minus implicit costs, or total revenue minus explicit plus implicit costs. Remember your order of operations, folks. Whether the parentheses are there matters. Don't fall into the trap of taking revenue, subtracting explicit, and then adding implicit costs back in. In the short run, there are going to be a bunch of costs that businesses have to take into account. Those are what we call factor payments. They're what the firm pays for the use of those factors of production: land, labor, physical capital, entrepreneurship, human capital, right? So those are costs, but from the owner of the factor, that is the worker or the person renting out the land, it's income. We've got some examples of factor payments at the bottom. The circular flow diagram reminds you that all money kind of can flow either from a firm to a household or from a household to a firm. Firms sell goods and services to households in exchange for payment for goods and services. That's that A and B circle. But on the inner circle, we have households selling labor services in exchange for wages, salaries, and benefits. Everything that's a cost to one person is a benefit to another. What's a cost to a firm is a benefit to a household. Cost to a household, benefit to firm. Two ways of measuring per unit costs, and they're both going to be informative, but we need to keep in mind that they're going to tell us different things. The first is average cost. Here we're going to call it average total cost, ATC. We'll also see average variable cost, same function, just with a V instead of a T. The average cost is the cost on average of producing a given quantity. You know how to calculate an average. You take your total cost, you divide it by the quantity of units you produce. ATC equals TC over Q. Marginal cost, though, very different. Looks very similar, but the triangles matter. It's the cost of producing one more unit of output. It's the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. Not total cost over quantity, change in total cost divided by change in quantity. You're going to have to do some subtracting here. They're also going to look very different. Your average cost decreasing here, it's usually going to be U-shaped, whereas your marginal cost tends to be swoosh-shaped. Goes down and then it starts climbing again. Average cost tends to be a flatter U-shape. We can also divide, as we did before, costs into fixed and variable. Fixed costs, cost of the fixed inputs. If you don't remember this, you can go back and watch the fixed versus variable mini lecture. I believe that was number 2 in this series. They don't change regardless of your level of production. They are unavoidable. You're going to have to pay them whether you want to or not. Variable costs, those are the costs of your variable inputs. Makes sense, right? They're incurred by the act of producing. The more you produce, the greater your variable costs are. Labor is a variable cost because you can call in extra workers or send workers home. Average variable cost divided by quantity, these are avoidable. Variable costs can be avoided, which I don't need to tell anybody after the coronavirus shutdown where a bunch of people were furloughed and sent home without pay. Thing to remember about different costs. Often there are sunk costs involved. Fixed costs are sunk. Once they're incurred, they cannot be recouped. Oh, you're shutting your business down? Why don't you just call your landlord and ask for your rent back? Oh, right, that's never going to happen. Sunk costs should be ignored. The spending's already been done, cannot be changed. The other thing to remember is that there's a profit margin, and that's the size of the difference between your per unit revenue and your per unit cost. If profit margin is positive, you're making money. Profit margin is negative, you're losing money. Profit margin is 0, no big deal. If it's an economic profit of 0, still pretty good. So for a quick review, ask yourself, what's the relationship between production and costs, including average and marginal costs? What are average total costs and average variable costs? How do you calculate them? How do you calculate and graph marginal cost? What's the relationship between marginal and average? And what is profit?